Hi, I'm Bob German, Cloud Developer Advocate for Microsoft. Recently, I had the pleasure of conducting a workshop as part of the Global Microsoft 365 Developer Bootcamp series. And the workshop is Build an Emergency Response Solution with Teams and SharePoint. This recording is the on-demand version of that workshop. And in a moment, I'll have a link to all the other workshop materials if you don't happen to be sitting on that page right now. The focus of the workshop is to build a solution that would be used by an emergency response team that was coordinating their efforts to respond to something like could be a hurricane or a snowstorm or almost any kind of emergency that would require some coordination among some kind of a central headquarters and probably people working in the field. And it's all built on Microsoft Teams, which fortunately works just as well on a mobile device as on a full desktop. And the thing that's interesting is the entire thing is developed using Microsoft SharePoint. So there's a number of advantages to that approach, which you'll learn during the course of the content. So welcome and thanks for watching. Let's dig in. So as I mentioned, this recording is intended to accompany a detailed lab tutorial, which you can find at https://aka.ms/bootcamp1lab, just as shown on the bottom of the screen. So we'll start with an introduction and an overview of the solution. Then I want to take a step back and show you how Teams and SharePoint work together in a number of different scenarios. Then I'll walk you through the lab setup steps. And I'll just show you a few additional details, especially about the SharePoint framework and the Microsoft Graph that may be helpful when you get to those labs. And then turn you loose and let you build this solution for yourself. Before I show you the solution, let me tell you a little bit of a backstory. Back in 2004, there was a tsunami that hit Myanmar, and it was a terrible disaster. At the time, I was working at the Microsoft Technology Center in Boston, and a bunch of us from all different Microsoft Technology Centers pitched in to build a website to help the relief workers coordinate their efforts. And the elements of the scenario here are really inspired by that website. We built it on SharePoint on some servers that we had in our lab, and it really helped them a lot from what I was told, at least I hope it did. We had it pretty easy, actually, sitting in our lab while they were out there dealing with the realities of the situation on the ground. But as we go through the different pieces of this, I'll actually point out that all of them were elements of the solution that we built for Myanmar. So the solution begins with news, and news stories get fed into the main conversation, as you can see here, as well as being available all the time on a tab inside of Teams, so that people can just go right in and find these stories, access the information as it's unfolding across the area. Another part of the original solution was inventory and supplies. So the idea here is that maybe some food arrives or some medical equipment, and where do people really need that the most? Right, so this solution is built on a simple SharePoint list. What's kind of interesting about it is it has some fun list formatting courtesy of Rabia Williams. So you can see the icons for the different supplies and the location, and even kind of dig in on the location a little bit if you want, and also the contacts and any comments that you have. And this is based on Microsoft Lists, which is another SharePoint-based technology, and uses just ordinary list formatting, but then it's been added into the team. Finally, there's a SharePoint framework-based solution that shows a map with trouble spots, and this uses Bing Maps as the underlying technology in SharePoint Framework. What's interesting about this is that rather than build a whole user interface to manage the push pins on this map, it's actually done with just a SharePoint list. So this list is appearing inside of what's called a task module in Microsoft Teams. A task module is really kind of like a modal dialog box that pops up. And in this case, I didn't need to write any special code to manage these pinpoints because it's built already into SharePoint. So for instance, let's suppose I wanted to add Central Park here. I can just save that. And what you'll notice is that the latitude and longitude are blank. So these have not been geocoded. But when I close this, it will automatically geocode that location and add it to the map. Just like that. Another thing that's kind of interesting about it is that this does its own list provisioning. So the lists are stored in the SharePoint site that's connected to this Microsoft team. I'll explain that in just a minute. The beauty of that is that everybody who's a member of the team now is going to have permission to the lists on that SharePoint site. So I could just make a new map by just adding a new list name here. Imagine that something's going on in the Boston area. That's usually a snowstorm or a blizzard of some kind. And now the map will show my current location with no push pins on it because I've got basically an empty list. Let me just add an item here. We have a building in Cambridge, Mass. That is the New England Research and Development, or Microsoft NERD Center. And that's at 1 Memorial Drive in Cambridge. And so now we'll see that get plotted on the map. And in the final lab exercise, you'll learn how to use the Microsoft Graph to send messages into the team where your tab is installed. In this case, we'll just note any new points that have been plotted on the map. And that will get you to use both the Teams JavaScript SDK to get your current channel ID and other information needed, and then to call the Microsoft Graph to actually send the message. So let's get started. So before I show you the lab content, I'd like to just cover a couple of simple concepts that are underlying all of this work. And the first is the relationship between Teams and SharePoint. When Teams first came out, people assumed that Teams might replace SharePoint, or why do I need SharePoint anymore? They didn't realize that every team has a SharePoint site built in, and that in fact these products work very closely together. Microsoft Teams is based on the idea of a Microsoft 365 group. So groups predated Teams by a bit of time, and they actually live in Azure Active Directory, where you have a collection of owners and a collection of members. And then there are also, outside of Azure AD, there are shared assets. Among them, a shared SharePoint team site that is, by default, synchronized with the group owners and members in terms of its permissions. So Teams uses all of this. So every Microsoft team has a Microsoft 365 group underneath of it. And that means by definition, it has a SharePoint team site associated with it, as well as an Outlook calendar, a hidden mailbox, which is where the team's messages go eventually for compliance reasons, OneNote planner, all kinds of things that are available there. If you're developing for Teams, you can count on that SharePoint site being there, and you can pretty much assume that the team members and owners are going to have member and owner permissions to that SharePoint site. That's a really powerful thing, because now you can use the lists and libraries and pages in that SharePoint site as part of your team solution, and it's pretty much going to work. So as you may or may not be aware, Teams stores all of its files in SharePoint and OneDrive. And OneDrive is really based also on SharePoint, so the underlying technologies and APIs are the same. Mostly the same anyway. So if you attach a file to a conversation in a Teams channel, that file is going to land in the SharePoint site underneath of that Teams channel. And it's also going to be in a folder that corresponds to the channel name. Also, if you go to the Files tab, you're going to see those same files. If you are in a one-on-one chat or a group conversation, then any files that you share are going to be in the sender's OneDrive site in a special folder called Microsoft Teams Chat Files. And the permissions will be updated to include everybody in that chat. This is an important concept for end users to understand too, because if I email somebody a file, usually they just have a snapshot of the file, and if I later update the file, they're not going to get those updates unless I send a new copy. In this case, any updates are actually going to be made to that shared version of the file, and people will just get them the next time they go and look at that file, which is often useful, but you also need to kind of be careful about it, I suppose. So here I am in a team, and if I go into the files, you'll see I have several files here. If I just click on this PDF, for example, what's interesting is I'm not actually using a PDF viewer. This is actually a SharePoint preview of the file. Furthermore, I can have a conversation about this over here on the left. It's easy to open and close that panel. And those conversation messages are going to appear here while I'm talking about the document and viewing the document, but they also appear in the underlying Teams channel, where they can draw people into the conversation and also connect them with that file. And as I mentioned, because the permissions are synced up in the Microsoft 365 group, I really don't have to worry about the user not being able to see the file that I've mentioned in the conversation. Now this also works with more obscure file types. This is a raw Canon file, for instance. And in the case of Office documents, it gets even better because you can actually edit the document. So here I am editing the document. Co-authoring is working, so multiple people can edit this document simultaneously, and we can discuss the document at the same time. How long had people been wanting that in SharePoint? Well, it is in SharePoint, but it also takes Teams better together, as I said. Now, there's this great ability here to add cloud storage, and a lot of the cloud storage providers are third party, but we also allow SharePoint storage, and this would be used if you had a document or a library somewhere other than the SharePoint site that is associated with this team. So now this other document library actually looks like a folder to the users in this team. The users may or may not have access to that, and similar to they may not have access to a Google Drive or a Dropbox that is inside of one of these cloud storage providers. But if they do have access, it gives them a nice seamless experience. Now let me just go ahead and click on Open in SharePoint, and we'll see those same files in the SharePoint UI. Of course, the SharePoint UI is richer, and I can do more things with it, but let me just point out that there's the channels of my team now as folders inside of this document library. So I'm going to leave it right there. There's a lot more we could do, but notice that I could use the sync tool from SharePoint in both Teams and SharePoint. All the compliance features are there. So there's really a number of advantages to everyone by using SharePoint's rich document management inside of Teams. Now, in addition to files, SharePoint also has a rich web page experience, and this is what we'll use to create the news inside of the lab in Exercise 2. I'll start by creating a connector. So connectors are a way of sending information from an external source into a Teams channel. And in this case, I will use SharePoint News Connector, which will notify the Teams channel when a new news article gets published. So there's not a lot to do here except click OK a couple of times, and it's configured, and it's automatically connected to that SharePoint site that's part of the Microsoft 365 group of this team. So it doesn't work on other sites. It's really connected with this one site. So if I come down into the site and go to its home page, yep, it's just another SharePoint site. It's not really anything unusual. I can come in and make a new news post. And as I said, you'll do this in exercise 2. And I can create a news story for my team. So in this case, let's talk about how Teams and SharePoint are better together. And I'll come up and grab an image. I really like the stock images, actually. They've gotten some really good ones. And because this is about SharePoint and Teams being better together, we'll pick some hearts. And it'll be very sweet for everyone. I need some quick content. So I'm just going to use the highlighted content web part as a way of quickly putting something on the page that's interesting looking. And there's my article. And the article appears on the home page. And it could appear in other places, in roll-ups, in places such as SharePoint Home and my SharePoint mobile app. Let's go back to the team, and hey, there it is. There is the connection working, and it has put a link to that article right inside the Teams channel. So that's exactly how we're going to do this inside of the lab. We're also going to take advantage of the ability to use SharePoint pages as tabs in Teams. Here's an example that you may have seen before. This is the Learning Pathways site in SharePoint, now being shown in some tabs that have been published to Microsoft Teams. And I'll show you how to do the exact same thing with a list in SharePoint for that supplies solution. Okay, so let's go through the labs one by one. The labs are at aka.ms/bootcamp1lab. And that will bring you to this GitHub repo where all the source code, the finished solution files, the presentation material, and the lab instructions are all here. And there's some useful tips here on how to use the labs. Let's just go into exercise 1, which is the lab setup. And the very first step is to get a tenant. If you don't have a developer tenant, you really shouldn't be building stuff in production. First, you may not have the administrative permissions you need to install the solutions, and secondly, you might break something or affect some users. So in general, it's better and safer to have your own sandbox to work in. And this is free. You can get your own developer tenant with 25 user licenses so that you can set up different users with different permissions and really rigorously test your solution. So the lab walks you through that. I won't say too much more about that. The next step is to enable Teams application uploads. So that is here. If I go into Microsoft 365 administration, if you've just created your tenant, you may not see Teams right away. You might also have to click Show All to find Teams, but we're going to go into Teams administration. And if this little hamburger is closed, open it up, find Teams apps, and then go to Setup Policies. Now, in a production environment, you might set up a policy that allows this for only a handful of users. But in your developer tenant, I'm just going to go in and set it org-wide. This is the checkbox here. Upload custom apps needs to be turned on. This allows you to install your applications directly from a tool called App Studio in Teams, and it also allows you to upload apps directly into individual teams. So this is a big convenience over the alternative that would require you, an administrator, to install the app into the Teams tenant app catalog. This can take up to 24 hours to take effect. Usually it happens in an hour or less, but it could take up to 24 hours. The way to check and see if it happened is to go into a team somewhere and click on the 3 dots to the right of the team name, not the channel name. Click on Manage Team, not Manage Tags. Click on Manage Team, and then click on Apps. And down here in the lower right corner, you should see a link that says Upload a Custom App. If that's not there, the policy hasn't kicked in yet. and probably want to just come back later, or you're going to have to manually upload everything into the tenant app catalog. Okay, so that's that piece. The next step in the lab prep is to set up the SharePoint app catalog. Now, you may have already done this, but going back to Microsoft 365 admin, this time I'll go into SharePoint. And here under More Features, there is a link called Apps. Now, my app catalog is already in existence, so your experience will be a little different, but there's a lot of screenshots and details in the instructions that lead you through creating this for the first time. This can take up to a half an hour to provision. It may appear sooner, and you may get errors when you upload for the first few minutes. So you want to give this time to do its entire provisioning job before you dig in. And then finally, this lab ends with creating the actual team that you'll use for your emergency response solution. And if you've never created a team, there's instructions here, but it really is pretty straightforward. So that's lab 1. Exercise 2 is the SharePoint news setup, and I kind of already showed you how that works. So there's a few more little things in the instructions, and it's pretty detailed, so I don't think you'll have any trouble following this one. And I'll just move on now to lab 3. Exercise 3 is where you'll set up the supplies needed portion of the solution. This is implemented as a SharePoint list, and so you can just follow the instructions, and it will have you apply some cool formatting courtesy of Rabia Williams, and all the details are here. So, and then you'll actually install that into your team using the new Microsoft Lists application. So the Lists application really is all about surfacing SharePoint lists. The lists aren't new, just the way of getting to them is new, and so I wanted to go ahead and include that here. But I also wanted to show you how to build your first actual Teams application. And so that's what happens next. If we take just a second, so a word about Teams applications. What are they anyway? Well, Teams application can implement all these different things like tabs and bots and connectors and messaging extensions which extend on Teams menus, task modules, which you'll see in the next lab exercise. All these things can be part of an app. What they all have in common is that none of them run in Teams. That's right, you heard me correct. They don't run in Teams. They just look like they run in Teams. And actually, they have to be hosted somewhere else. So tabs are just web pages that are hosted outside of Teams. And then to get Teams to put it on the screen, you have to put the location of that web page into a file called manifest.json. And then that has to be zipped up into a solution package along with a small and a large icon. There's a lot of information in that manifest. And so what you'll do in the third step of exercise 3 is actually create one of these. And the easiest way to do that is using another Teams app called App Studio. And App Studio has a manifest editor that exists purely to edit that manifest.json. So here's an example that actually shows some SharePoint tabs. And you'll actually do this. You'll fill in all the details of your application. They kind of have to be just so. Everything needs to be completed inside here pretty much. And then you will create a tab. So I'm not going to get into configurable tabs, but I have a blog article about that I'll point you to inside of the lab instructions. You'll get a pointer to that at the bottom. It's a challenge to add a configurable tab. So something you should realize is that in Teams, if you're writing an application that is going to run inside of a team or inside of a group conversation, your tabs will be so-called configurable tabs. And what you get to specify is the tab configuration URL. And then there's a pop-up that gets to interact with the user and configure the tab. If you're writing a personal app, which is just going to be used by individual users, then those are so-called static tabs. And you configure those down here. So that's what I'll have you do, is configure these. And then let me show you an example. If the location is in SharePoint, you can just put the SharePoint URL into the website URL. This is the website URL is what gets shown when Teams pops out a special separate web browser. And so that's just the unaltered URL. In the case of a SharePoint page that's going to run inside of the Teams UI, there's some magic that has to be added to the URL, and the lab will guide you through this. If you're testing and all you get is a blank screen, chances are that this is what you need. You need to add this Teams login, and then eventually at the end of the URL, point it to the original location. And that just makes sure that the login is all set. Now, once you've set up your tabs, you'll then test and distribute. And this is where that sideload or that upload policy comes in that we set a little while ago, right? If you want to be able to click install and just test your app just like that, you need to have that policy in effect. If it's not in effect, or if you just maybe you want to install it for more than just yourself, then the thing to do is to download the app. You'll get a zip file downloaded to you, and then you can come into apps here and upload that app. Now, the policy is allowing me to upload this for me or my individual teams, and my admin status as an administrator of the MS Labs tenant is what will allow me to install apps into MS Labs. So if you're trying to work around that policy and you're a tenant admin, you can use the upload, and then your apps will show up here under built for your tenant name, and users can actually then go in and start using your app. Also, those app setup policies that I showed earlier, those can be used to pin your app, like this get started one is pinned here. And you can push them out to users, proactively install them for users, and proactively pin them for users using those app setup policies. You can also set up permissions on who can use the apps inside of the app policies. So that's a really important area to know about. So anyway, that is really what lab exercise number 3 is all about. So in exercises 4 and 5, we'll be working with the SharePoint framework, which is a coding type of exercise. And the code is written for you, but you can modify it and play with it if you want, or if you're not a coder, you can just follow the instructions and get it going. And this is for that map that I showed you during the demo. So SharePoint Framework is a model for building web parts in SharePoint. These are widgets. That means that they share the page with other pieces of code, and this works now in Teams tabs. Has a number of advantages in that SharePoint Framework is modern and responsive. It has built-in support for calling the Graph API, which is in exercise 5. And it also allows hassle-free hosting on SharePoint. So SharePoint hosts the tab. It also handles single sign-on to the tab. So really, you don't have to worry about nearly as much as if you were starting from scratch and building your tab based on some other web server. Now, if you already have another web server, this is probably not for you. If you already have a website or a web-based application, chances are you can reuse that. But this class is about SharePoint, so that's where we're going to focus. Now, I mentioned that Teams apps run outside of Teams and you have a Teams manifest. This gets a little bit more interesting in SharePoint Framework because the SharePoint web part has a manifest too. And that has to get installed inside of the SharePoint app catalog. Remember that? We set that up a little while ago. And then that somehow needs to become a Teams app. So that's the steps that you'll run through here. When you set up your SharePoint Framework web part as a Teams tab, SharePoint actually spins up a page called teamshostedapp.aspx. And that's what runs your web part inside of the iframe. Since the solution here is already built, I want to show what it would be like if you were starting completely from scratch. So this takes a while to run, so I'm actually going to run a timer so you can get an idea of how long it's running. And I'm just going to type yo Microsoft/SharePoint. So I had to install some things on my machine in order for this to work. And those are also detailed inside of the instructions. So I gave my solution a name, and I'm going to do it for SharePoint Online because Teams only runs in the cloud, so that doesn't work on premises. And I'll go ahead and, this is important, it's going to ask if I want to allow the tenant admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites. Well, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem here. You're going to want to install this into Teams, but the Teams may not yet be created. So there's no easy way from Teams to install the SharePoint Framework web part so that the app will work. So the best practice is to allow the admin to install this across all Teams. And then in a minute, I'll show you how to keep that web part from showing up on all your other SharePoint pages where you didn't really want maybe to have that available. So I'll say yes to that, and I'm going to build a web part. And I also get to choose between no JavaScript framework, React, or Knockout. So I'll take React, and off we go. And there we go. And you can see this took over 3 minutes to run. So, you know, and I have a pretty fast internet connection. So expect this to take a while to download all of the dependencies that are needed to run the solution. Most of these are used at build time and not at runtime. So you don't have to worry that all this is going to be, you know, downloading to your end users. So gulp serve is the command to debug locally. And I'll show you what that looks like. That's it. So notice that I'm on localhost :4321, and I'm browsing there and testing there, and also my compiled web part, the JavaScript bundle, is also on localhost :4321. Not that useful though, because I'm not in Teams and I really want to build for Teams. So I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code now and find the SharePoint web part manifest, which is here under the web part in the source directory. And what you'll notice on line 15 is that supported hosts is set to SharePoint web part, which means this solution right now can only work on a SharePoint web part page as a web part. So I don't really want that. I want Teams. So I'll change that to Teams tab. And then also, if I wanted it to be in a personal tab, I would say Teams personal app here. And now I can deploy this everywhere, but it's not going to show up on the list of web parts in people's SharePoint sites. Instead, it's only going to be usable via Teams. Okay, so having made that change, I'm going to go ahead and bundle the solution. So this takes all of the source code and compiles it into a JavaScript bundle. And now I'm going to package that, which is going to create the SharePoint solution package that I can upload to SharePoint. But before I do that, I need to actually run the gulp server again. So the way I did it, I didn't put -- ship on the gulp bundle or the gulp package solution commands. So if you don't put -- ship, then it will assume that your JavaScript bundle is running under localhost. This is the best way to debug because you can easily change your code very, very quickly and it'll just recompile in the background. And so that's what I'm doing now. If I put -- ship on the end of the bundle and package solution command, and this is all explained in the lab instructions. If I put -- ship, then that would actually upload the code to SharePoint's content delivery network, where it would be served up to actual users. So I would have to redeploy it if I made a code change, but I don't have to have my my little local web server running all the time in order to use it. So that's the way to deploy it to more users. Okay, so now my local server is running just to provide access to that bundle. And I'm going to go into the SharePoint app catalog and upload that thing. The file is inside of my solution, and inside of there will be a SharePoint folder, a solution folder, and then there's an SPPKG file inside of that actually has the SharePoint solution package. So I'll click OK, wait for that to upload, and I'm going to get prompted again about this admin thing. Both the developer has to ask for it, and now the admin has to agree to make this solution available in all sites. So you want to make sure to check that off. Click Deploy. In a moment or two later, it will be deployed. And what you want to do as a best practice is just make sure there were no errors. So go and find that. You won't have as many as me probably, so it'll be a little easier to find. And make sure that there were no errors in deploying that. If there are errors, well, there might be a mistake inside of your manifest or something, but if you're doing the labs and there's errors, chances are you need to wait for the SharePoint app catalog to finish deploying. Because if you do this right after you create it, you're much more likely to just get a transient error. So now what I'm going to do is not going to work in the lab. I'm going to synchronize this solution directly to the Teams app catalog. So I want to show you how to do it. It doesn't work in all cases. And in the case of the map, I actually had to give permission to call the Bing Maps API and to render the Bing Maps control. So that required something special in the Teams manifest. So this automatically generated manifest that I'm about to show would not work for that. But if you have a fairly simple manifest, you can just click Sync to Teams, and just like that, and your app will turn up inside of the Teams tenant app catalog. So let's go see that. We'll just come under Apps, and it's not there yet. It does take a moment. So I'll refresh, and hopefully it will be there. And yep, there it is. It's this Hello World app. So that's the one I just created. And I can add this for my personal use, and there we go. That's it. It's that simple, right? So that's the basic process. So here is the code for that map viewer, and I'll just point out a few things. One is that Teams manifest. So I mentioned that I needed a custom manifest, and here it is. So a lot of the things in here are kind of tokenized. So for instance, the location of the tab URL is not hard-coded in here, and the reason is because it's actually going to be hosted inside of a different SharePoint site depending on what team you're in. It's always going to be the SharePoint site that's associated with that team, so the URL is going to keep changing. So you just kind of want to take this from the SharePoint framework generator to start with, because it will get all that part right. But then here under valid domains, I had to add virtualearth.net, which was necessary for calling the Bing Maps API and for rendering the Bing Maps control. So Teams will actually check, and it won't let you use or access a domain that's not on this list. And that's just a security feature that you need to be aware of. And notice that wildcards work, so there's that. Now let me just show you a couple other little things about the code in case you're interested. This is a React solution, and so I actually used a off-the-shelf component, a node package, for the actual map. So here, React Bing Maps is actually doing the rendering. I'm not going to go through every little bit of code, but what I do want to show you is the editing experience. So the editing experience is handled down here in this message panel. And when somebody clicks that button to launch the editor, it actually calls this code right here in the function starting on line 37. And what it does is it actually, on line 39, it checks to make sure that the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK is present. And that's just another node reference that gets imported at the top of the code. You can see it here on line 5. right? So we'll make sure that that's available. And then I'm going to create a task module, which, as I mentioned, is really just a dialog box. So I get to give it a title. The URL that I'm going to give it is the location of the SharePoint list. And then I'm going to give it a width and a height. And start task will actually run will actually open up that task module. When the user closes the task module, I'm going to get a callback, which is here on line 48, and I'm going to call my refresh logic, which will go and look for any map points that haven't been geocoded and then plot all the points on the map. So I'm not going to go into that part. I'm trying to just stay with the Teams part, but you're welcome to look at that. I just mainly wanted to show you how this task module works. It's only a few lines of code. Another area to point you to is here under Services. Oops. Here under Services, I have a few different internal services that I've set up. Map data service is what gets me the map data that I'm going to plot on the map. Bing Map service does the geocoding. And Graph service calls the Graph API. And again, I'm not going to walk through all the code, but let me just show you some highlights here about the graph use. So one thing I might want to do is get a list ID. This is just so that I can get the URL of that list for the task module. It actually requires the GUID of the list. I know the name of the list from the web part settings, but I need the global unique ID. And so I'm going to call this graph method lists/list name and actually get back the ID here on line 20, get back that ID and pass that back to my caller. Another thing that I need to do is actually get the list items. This is going to get all those data points for the map. And I've kind of abstracted out the details of this particular list. But what you can see is that it's actually going to go in and read those items and expand it to show the actual field names so that I can match those up when I pass the data back to the user or back to the caller. Update list item, this gets used after the geocoding to push values back into the SharePoint list with the graph. So if you want to know how to do that, take a look here. Create list. So if the user specifies a list in the web part settings, and I should show you the web part settings. I'll do that in just a sec. But if they specify a list and it's not there yet, then this code runs. And what it does is it actually creates a brand new list and sets up all the columns. The columns are specified in this format here. So this is what that looks like when we actually pass this off to the graph and ask it to create the list, and it will create all those columns at the same time. Now I said I would show the configuration part, so let's take a look at that. All I did was I created the web part properties just like I would any other SharePoint framework web part. That may not be very helpful to you if you've never created one, but here's the properties on line 16, and you can see that I've got the Bing map key here under credentials, the zoom level, the map type, and a list name. And if I come down to the bottom, this specifies the property pane look and feel. So I could just edit that normally if this was a web part. In the case of Teams, it actually uses that same configuration panel for me, which is really handy. So if I want to add another one of these web parts, for instance, if I want to add another one of these tabs, I would come in here and you'll see that that same configuration that I would see in SharePoint is displayed right here inside of my tab. So users can come in here and change the settings just like that. If, for instance, I was like, oops, no, I really wanted an aerial map, no problem. You can do that too. Now, to make all those graph calls, I actually needed permission. So in Azure Active Directory, which is the security system underlying all of this, it's more like your phone operating system that doesn't just let applications do anything that the user could do. Because, for instance, an application could read your contacts and send spam emails to all of them if it had your full permission. So these days, users want a little bit more control over what the apps are doing. So in this case, the graph, we need permission to make those graph calls. And so you can see that here. I'm looking at a file called packagesolution.json. It's part of the SharePoint framework project. And on line 9 are the web API permission requests, where we're actually going to ask the system, could I please have these particular access rights to the Microsoft graph? And in the lab exercise, you'll actually have to approve these as an administrator, so you'll see what that's really like. Now, how did I know what permissions to request? And the answer is I read it in the documentation. So this is the reference for all of the graph calls. You can also view the ones that are in beta if you want to get access to some future ones that are going to be available soon. And they're actually available now, but they're subject to change without notice. They don't have the same service level agreement, so you really should think twice before using them in production, because it could just break and Microsoft will say, gee, we're sorry that it broke, but it was in beta. We told you it wasn't supported. So, just be aware of that. Anyway, every call, this is the create a list call, has a section for permissions. We're going to use delegated work or school accounts in this scenario. So the permission that's needed is sites.manage.all, and that's where I got that from. Often, this is a fairly big privilege. We're moving towards more granular, smaller privileges and permissions. So as those come out, you'll see them listed, and they always list the permissions from the least to the most privileged. So you want the least amount of privilege that you can request that gets the job done. And then back here in SharePoint administration, there's this API access option where you can actually review and approve those requests. Notice that these requests, and in order for it to work in Teams, these are organization-wide permissions. It's kind of unfortunate. You have to be aware, if I give group.readwrite.all to my Teams tab, every third-party web part in the tenant will get that permission. So hoping that they'll work on that, but right now that's the state of affairs. There are isolated apps, but they don't currently work in Teams. So I've been talking a lot about Graph. If you're not familiar, Graph is the universal API for Microsoft 365. It really is where our future investments are going. So in the case of these SharePoint lists, you could use the native SharePoint API. And, the SharePoint police or the Graph police aren't going to come in and yell at you for that. It's just that Graph is actually more where our future investments are going, and it opens up all of Microsoft 365 to you. So that's really a good thing. Now, in almost every Teams app I've written or worked on has eventually required the Graph, because the JavaScript SDK that we looked at to open that task module, it doesn't really do that much. It's just the minimum requirement to do things that have to be done locally in the web browser, like open a login pop-up or a task module, things like that. You can get access to your current team ID and channel ID in that JavaScript SDK, but if you want to query the whole team structure, if you want to get information about the user and their profile, if you want to access all those other assets that are inside of the Microsoft 365 group, Graph is the way to go. Now, I like to think of Graph and Teams as siblings. So if Teams is the universal user interface for Microsoft 365, Graph is the universal API for Microsoft 365. Your app, as I mentioned, doesn't run in Teams. It runs alongside of Teams. And so it's going to call the Graph API to get access to the backend services, just like Teams does. and it will need an access token. And fortunately, the SharePoint framework takes care of that for you. So I actually have a service factory class in the web part that kind of instantiates all the services and stitches them together. You can think of it as sort of a poor person's dependency injection. And this is where I'm getting the graph client. And so you'll see here on line 30 and 31 is where I'm going to get that client. That client is preloaded with the correct authorization header and that auth token that I keep mentioning. So this is one of the big advantages of SharePoint hosting, is that SharePoint gives you the access token. You don't have to go through any extra steps to get it yourself. So in exercise 5, you're going to add your own graph calls to post a message into the Teams channel when a new point gets added on the map. And so I think, you know, the instructions should be easy to follow, but you'll notice that I'm doing one more call than I was doing before. I need a little bit more permission than I had before, and I'm going to have to rebuild the solution package and redeploy it and even consent to those permissions, those extra permissions that I need to get access to adding something to the conversation. The GitHub repo also includes a resources page, which has links to all kinds of information about Teams application development, including a new and improved main page for the Teams developer documentation, App Studio installation instructions. Also, the Teams toolkit for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code is here, which is great if you're building bots or non-SharePoint framework tabs. There's a great Microsoft Learn program here that you can follow, as well as tons of code samples and production-ready app templates, and all that is here. Plus some other videos. Some of these are from me, some of them are from others. Here's a couple of articles on using SharePoint pages as apps, and also on the SharePoint framework in Teams. So check out those resources to kind of expand your learning. So this is a great time to dig in and actually do the labs. I hope you enjoy them, and I really want to thank you for watching the video and trying the labs. I also want to thank all the MVPs and teammates who helped to QA the labs, provide feedback, and proctor the actual bootcamp experience. And I especially want to thank Aicha Bosch, Rabia Williams, and Charmaine Graving, who really worked a lot on this, and without whom none of this would have been possible. So thanks very much, and enjoy the labs. And please submit any feedback in the issues list in GitHub. Have fun.